first thing to vanish is not the weapon, but the world around it. A lake recedes, forests shift, herds move along the water's edge, following grass, shade, and the hidden memory of older paths. Then mud closes over broken branches, butchered bones, splinters, tools, and long wooden shafts shaped by hands no one will ever see. Layer after layer settles above them. Cold periods come and go. Trees return, disappear, and return again. Entire human populations pass through Europe and leave almost nothing behind. Much later, machines arrive in northern Germany and begin cutting into the earth for brown coal. Steel teeth tear through sediments that have lain undisturbed for hundreds of thousands of years. What emerges from that industrial wound is not gold, stonework, or the ruin of a forgotten city. It is wood. At Schöningen, near the eastern edge of Lower Saxony, open-cast lignite mining exposed a buried Pleistocene landscape preserved with an intimacy that archaeology rarely receives. Rescue excavations began in the 1990s because the mine was moving steadily across ground that would otherwise be destroyed. Archaeologists worked in the shadow of machinery, recording ancient surfaces before modern extraction erased them. Yet beneath that severe industrial horizon lay the remains of a lakeside environment where large animals gathered and human hunters repeatedly returned. Waterlogged deposits had sealed away organic materials that normally decay within years or centuries. Here they endured long enough to cross a distance in time so great that even the identity of their makers remains uncertain. The most famous discoveries were long, carefully worked wooden weapons, recovered from what became known as the spear horizon. Their appearance was immediately unsettling in the best scientific sense. They did not resemble crude branches sharpened in haste. They were straightened, balanced, tapered, and finished with close attention to the properties of the wood. Some were made from spruce, a tree whose trunks could provide long, regular forms when selected carefully. Others used different conifers. Their points were not accidental. Their shafts were not random. Whoever made them understood how grain behaves, where a trunk is strongest, how weight should be distributed, and how a weapon must feel in the hand before it can be trusted against a fast and powerful animal. The weapons were deposited somewhere between roughly 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Although their exact age remains actively debated, it affects the way researchers think about the people who made them. A date closer to 300,000 years ago has often encouraged comparisons with Homo heidelbergensis, or populations moving toward the Neanderthal lineage. A date closer to 200,000 years ago makes Neanderthals a more plausible candidate, but no human fossil was found directly within the weapon-bearing layer. The hands behind the spears therefore remain anonymous. Stone tools, animal remains, and the wooden objects reveal behavior with remarkable clarity, while the bodies of the hunters themselves are absent. This absence makes Schöningen more powerful, not less. The site forces the evidence of action to stand on its own. For much of the 20th century, early humans in Europe were often imagined as opportunists living close to the edge of survival. They might have scavenged carcasses left by large carnivores, gathered what could be found, and relied on simple tools while avoiding direct confrontation with healthy prey. Organized hunting was sometimes reserved for much later humans, especially Homo sapiens. Schöningen disrupted that comfortable sequence. Here were purpose-built weapons beside numerous horse remains showing butchery and processing. The association suggested not merely contact with dead animals, but active, repeated participation in obtaining and dismembering large prey. That conclusion did not appear fully formed on the day the first spear emerged. Deposits shift, objects can move in water, bones accumulate through different processes. A weapon lying near an animal does not automatically prove how the animal died. Yet the pattern at Schöningen grew harder to dismiss as excavation continued. More wooden implements appeared, more traces of working, repair, reuse, and manufacture came into view. The site began to look less like a single dramatic accident, and more like a place where skilled people brought knowledge, equipment, and expectation to a productive landscape. The lake itself was part of that system. It attracted horses and other animals. It shaped movement, visibility, and access. It may have offered hunters natural advantages, though the exact position of dry ground and shallow water remains debated because much of the weapon horizon lay in an environment affected by repeated inundation. This simple image of hunters standing on a firm bank and waiting for a herd to pass may be too neat. What survives suggests a more complicated shoreline, shifting over time with wet margins, exposed patches, reed zones, and routes that changed as water levels rose and fell. The landscape was not a frozen wasteland. Schöningen belongs to the Ice Age in the broad Pleistocene sense, but its environment could include open grass, woodland, and relatively mild seasons. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story beneath the coal mine is not only about weapons, it is about the danger of believing that what survives is all that ever existed. Stone dominates prehistory because stone endures. Wood, fibre, hide, bark, cord, and countless other materials usually disappear. When they vanish, the intelligence invested in them vanishes too. A carefully shaped spear may rot into nothing while a rough flake of stone survives beside it for geological ages. Future observers then inherit a distorted inventory and may mistake absence for simplicity. Schöningen opens a narrow window into that missing world. The long weapons are only the beginning. Later analysis would reveal an entire wooden technology: hunting spears, throwing sticks, split wood tools, fragments under repair, reused pieces, and discarded stages of production. The people who worked beside this ancient lake did not simply possess objects, they possessed procedures. They knew where suitable trees grew, when wood could be cut, how it should be transported, how a shaft could be corrected, and when a damaged implement still held value. Such knowledge had to be remembered and, in some form, transmitted. Standing at the edge of the excavation, the contrast is almost too sharp. Above lies a mine created to extract fuel from ancient vegetation. Below lies evidence that ancient humans were themselves extracting possibility from wood. One industry cuts through the remains of forests compressed into coal. The other survives as a handful of trunks reshaped into tools. Between them stretches an immense interval filled with climate cycles, extinctions, migrations, and forgotten lives. The coal mine did not merely uncover several old spears, it exposed a lost chapter in the history of human competence, one in which hunting was already becoming an art long before anyone wrote down a name. The lost chapter begins with the simple fact: wood almost never survives long enough to become history. A spear left on ordinary ground softens, cracks, feeds fungi, and returns to the soil. In a few generations, even a finely made weapon can disappear so completely that no future excavator could prove it existed. Stone flakes remain, bone sometimes endures, and teeth can outlast entire landscapes. But wood is usually erased. That imbalance has shaped the way prehistory has been imagined. Archaeologists reconstructed ancient life mainly from materials that resist decay, and those materials made the past appear harder, rougher, and more limited than it may have been. At Schöningen, the normal rules were interrupted. The ancient lake margins created waterlogged sediments in which oxygen was greatly reduced. Microorganisms that usually break down wood could not work normally. Branches, worked shafts, bark, plant remains, and other organic traces were buried rapidly enough to be sealed from the open air. The same wet conditions that made the ancient ground difficult to interpret also made it generous. What was lost almost everywhere else remained here in compressed, darkened form, fragile but recognizable. This preservation did not save only the spectacular objects. It held together an entire environmental archive. Pollen grains recorded the plants growing around the lake. Insects preserved clues about temperature and season. Seeds, small branches, and pieces of bark helped reconstruct the vegetation. Animal bones retained cut marks, fractures, and patterns of processing. Sediments captured changes in water depth, shoreline position, and the repeated arrival of mud. Even objects that looked unimpressive at first could contain evidence of manufacture or use. A short fragment might preserve the angle of a cut. A split piece might reveal how a trunk had been opened. A worn surface might show that a tool had been held, scraped, repaired, or reshaped before it was discarded. The result is not a frozen scene in the literal sense. Schöningen does not offer a single untouched moment. Like a room abandoned yesterday. Water moved. Shorelines shifted. Objects could settle, tilt, or be displaced over short distances. Different activities may have occurred at different times before becoming compressed into the same archaeological layer. Scholars still debate the precise depositional history of parts of the site, yet the waterlogged setting preserved enough detail to make those debates possible. In a drier deposit, there would be no wooden objects to argue over. The survival process also created a modern problem. Ancient waterlogged wood can look stable underground while being structurally vulnerable once exposed. The cells have lost much of their original strength. Water may be carrying the shape of the object as much as the remaining wood itself. If such an artifact dries too quickly, it can shrink, twist, split, or collapse. Excavation, therefore, becomes an act of rescue in two directions. Archaeologists must remove the object before mining destroys it, but they must also protect it from the air that makes ordinary handling possible. Each wooden find demands patience. Sediment is cleared carefully so that tool marks are not mistaken for recent damage. The object is supported while still wet. Its position, orientation, and relationship to nearby bones and sediments are recorded before movement. Conservation may involve controlled storage, chemical stabilization, scanning, and years of monitoring. The famous weapons are impressive because they are long and recognizable, but their preservation depends on countless small decisions made after discovery. A shaft surviving hundreds of thousands of years can still be ruined in an afternoon if allowed to dry without control. This fragility changes the atmosphere of the excavation. Stone tools can often be lifted, cleaned, labelled, and stored with confidence. Waterlogged wood behaves more like a message written in melting ice. It has reached the present, but not securely. The archaeologist works knowing that the object has endured climate cycles, sediment pressure, and immense spans of time, only to become most vulnerable at recovery. The mine machinery nearby adds pressure. The ancient layer exists inside an active industrial landscape, and excavation must proceed within schedules determined partly by modern extraction. The preservation at Schöningen also exposes the scale of what has disappeared elsewhere. If one lakeside locality can yield long weapons, throwing sticks, split wood implements, worked fragments, and plant remains, then countless other sites may once have held similar technologies. Their organic equipment simply decayed. A stone hand axe found alone may once have belonged to a toolkit that included digging sticks, bark containers, wooden handles, wedges, clubs, carrying frames, traps, and cords. None of these need survive for them to have shaped daily life. What remains in stone may be only the durable edge of a much larger system. This does not mean every missing object should be imagined into existence. Archaeology cannot replace absent evidence with wishful reconstruction. No single explanation fully accounts for all the gaps in the record, and unsupported inventions would create a different distortion. Schöningen matters because it provides direct evidence where speculation once dominated. It proves that Middle Pleistocene humans could produce complex wooden objects, repair them, and use several manufacturing strategies. It does not prove that every population everywhere possessed the same equipment, but it shifts the burden of caution. Simplicity can no longer be assumed merely because organic tools are absent. The lake preserved traces of selection as well as traces of use. Suitable timber was not always growing immediately beside the find spot. Some wood appears to have been transported from elsewhere, perhaps over several kilometers. That detail suggests that preservation begins long after the human story has unfolded. Before a shaft reached the mud, someone had recognized a useful tree, cut or collected it, moved the raw material, and worked it through a sequence of decisions. The sediment preserves the final object, but every object points backward toward actions that left no direct trace. There is something almost paradoxical in this. Water, which complicates reconstruction of the ancient shoreline, is also the reason the evidence exists. Mud, which hides detail from view, protected microscopic marks from erosion. The same low oxygen conditions that darkened and weakened the wood prevented its complete disappearance. Schöningen survives because a particular chain of events happened in the right order. Tools were lost or discarded, sediments covered them, water excluded oxygen, and later geology carried them beyond ordinary decay. When the first longshafts emerged, they seemed almost impossible because the human mind had become accustomed to a stone age defined by stone. Yet beneath the coal mine lay the remains of another age nested inside it, an age of perishable materials and practiced hands. The weapons were extraordinary, but the greater revelation was preservation itself. It showed that the archaeological record is not a complete memory of human behavior. It is a filter, and at Schöningen, for a rare moment, that filter became slightly less severe. Once preservation made the wooden record visible, the famous spears stopped standing alone. The deeper researchers looked, the less Schöningen resembled a site defined by a handful of spectacular weapons. Reanalysis of the collection identified 187 wooden artifacts from the spear horizon, transforming the picture from an isolated hunting episode into the remains of a broad technological system. At least 20 pieces were hunting weapons, while dozens of others belonged to a world of cutting, scraping, shaping, handling, repairing, and everyday work. Among them were 35 implements made from split wood, along with fragments, blanks, broken pieces, and objects whose purposes remain uncertain. The surprise was not simply that wood had survived. It was that so many different decisions had survived with it. A long spear draws attention because its function seems immediate. Its pointed form, balanced shaft, and association with animal bones suggest danger and impact. A smaller fragment is quieter. It may have no dramatic silhouette and no obvious name. Yet the small objects often reveal more about routine behavior. Some show careful splitting along the grain. Others preserve scraped surfaces, trimmed edges, or ends modified for tasks that cannot be reconstructed with confidence. A few may have served in hide working, plant processing, tool maintenance, or handling animal remains. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeologists resist assigning a precise function whenever wear patterns and form do not justify one. Even so, the variety is unmistakable. This variety changes the scale of the human presence beside the lake. If the deposit contained only several long weapons and horse bones, it might be imagined primarily as a kill location hunters arrive, strike, butcher, and leave. The larger wooden assemblage suggests a place where more complicated work unfolded. Equipment was brought in, used, damaged, adjusted, and sometimes discarded. Raw pieces were shaped, broken objects were reworked, domestic tools accompanied hunting gear. The site was therefore not only about the brief moment when a weapon met an animal, it was also about the hours before and after preparation, maintenance, carcass processing, and the labour that turns a successful encounter into usable food and materials. The distinction between weapon and household tool may also be more modern than ancient. A piece of wood can pass through several roles during its life. A shaft that begins as hunting equipment may later be shortened, reshaped, and used for another purpose. A split fragment may become a wedge, scraper, handle, or pointed implement. At Schöningen, some broken items appear to have been recycled rather than abandoned immediately. This suggests that suitable wood carried value. The people using it understood that a damaged object was not always useless. They saw remaining length, good grain, workable edges, and new possibilities inside a failure. That habit of reuse matters because it reveals a mental inventory extending beyond the object's original design. Repair requires diagnosis. Recycling requires imagining a second function. Both imply familiarity with the material and with the tasks for which it might still be suited. None of this demands modern industry or formal planning, but it does show a disciplined relationship with resources. These people were not merely reacting to what lay before them. They were managing a toolkit. The toolkit was made from different parts of trees and produced through different methods. Some objects were worked from complete stems or slender trunks. Others were split from larger pieces, allowing craftspeople to follow the grain and create thinner, flatter forms. That difference is technically important. Working a whole stem preserves its natural circular structure, while splitting opens possibilities of controlled shapes difficult to obtain by simple trimming. The collection therefore records more than one recipe for making wooden equipment. It preserves a repertoire. A repertoire must be remembered. The maker needs to know which procedure suits which desired form, how much material can be removed without weakening the piece, and what defects can be tolerated. Knots, bends, twisted grain, and cracks influence every stage. The finished object reflects not just effort but judgment. Some choices are visible in the artifact. Many others disappeared with the shavings and hands that produced it. What survives in the record suggests repeated practice rather than accidental invention. The 187 artifacts do not all represent complete tools. Many are fragments, and several resist confident classification. That caution is essential. A broken stick can be natural. A polished surface can result from sediment movement. Cracks may form after burial. Researchers therefore examine microscopic traces, fracture patterns, cut angles, and the relationship between marks before identifying deliberate modification. The count emerged from systematic reassessment, not from treating every piece of wood as human workmanship. Even after close study, ambiguity remains. That uncertainty does not weaken the collection. It shows how carefully the boundary between nature and technology must be drawn. Seen together, the objects create a texture of activity. One can imagine long shafts lying near butchered horse remains, smaller implements used in close work, unfinished pieces waiting for shaping, and broken objects considered for reuse. Yet it is important not to freeze all 187 pieces into one afternoon. The deposit may represent repeated visits and multiple events. Water and sediment could have combined material from different moments. The assemblage is best understood as an accumulated record of behavior at a favored place, not necessarily as the inventory of one group abandoned at once. This accumulation may be precisely what makes Schöningen so revealing. A single weapon proves that a weapon existed. A large and varied collection reveals a technological tradition. It shows recurring choices, shared methods, and a range of needs extending beyond pursuit and killing. Hunting was embedded inside a larger economy of work. The people at the lake had to process animals, maintain equipment, exploit plant materials, and respond to damage. Their wooden objects formed an adaptable system rather than a narrow set of specialized instruments. The older image of early hunters carrying little more than stone flakes and sharpened branches becomes difficult to sustain here. Stone tools were certainly essential, including for making the wooden pieces, but they were part of an interdependent technology. A stone edge cut wood. The wooden tool then performed tasks the stone could not. The apparent dominance of stone in prehistory is therefore partly an accident of preservation. At Schöningen, wood steps back into view and reveals how incomplete that durable record has been. The long spears remain the icons, displayed as evidence that ancient humans could confront large prey. But the lesser objects quietly deepen the claim. They show that mastery of the hunt did not begin at the instant of throwing or thrusting. It rested on a background of manufacture, repair, resource judgment, and ordinary labor. Beneath the mine, archaeologists did not find a few miraculous weapons isolated from daily life. They found the surviving pieces of an organized wooden world. Before a spear could be balanced, sharpened, carried, or thrown, someone had to find the right tree. The hunters did not simply break branches from whatever grew nearest the water. The wooden artifacts reveal deliberate selection of species, trunk form, grain, diameter, and mechanical quality. Most long weapons were made from spruce, with pine and larch also represented. These choices suggest people who understood that different woods bend, split, resist impact, and carry weight in different ways. Spruce can provide long, straight trunks with relatively even grain, especially when young trees grow densely and compete for light. Such wood can become a shaft light enough to handle and strong enough to survive repeated strain. Yet a suitable tree is not simply a species label. Two spruces growing side by side may offer very different material. One may twist, fork, or contain knots. Another may rise straight with fewer defects. The maker had to read the tree before cutting it, judging its future shape while it was still rooted. That judgment continued after the timber was obtained. The outer form of a trunk does not always reveal the grain inside. A craftsman working with stone tools must remove bark, test the surface, and watch how fibers respond to cutting. If the grain curves, the shaft may weaken when heavily trimmed. If a knot lies near the intended point, it can become a fracture line. The best route is often to follow the wood's natural structure and adjust the design accordingly. What survives suggests that Schöningen's woodworkers learned this through long experience. Some raw material may have been transported from beyond the immediate lakeshore, possibly over several kilometers. The exact distance remains debated because ancient vegetation shifted through time, and researchers must reconstruct where suitable trees grew. Even so, selected conifers in a setting where they may not have been locally abundant imply planning before arrival. A long trunk is awkward to carry. Moving it requires effort and a reason strong enough to justify it. The weapon therefore begins not at the kill site, but elsewhere in the landscape, where a person recognizes useful wood and imagines what it can become. Transporting timber also raises questions about when the work was done. A trunk may be easier to move after branches and bark are removed, but early trimming risks damaging the future shaft. Some shaping may have occurred near the source, with further work completed beside the lake. Alternatively, partly prepared blanks could have been carried to a location where the group expected to hunt and process animals. No single explanation fully accounts for every artifact, but the collection preserves several stages of manufacture, suggesting work distributed across time rather than completed in one hurried session. The tools used were largely stone, but the process was not crude. A sharp flake can slice bark, shave ridges, and score a controlled line. Heavier edges can chop through fibers or remove stubborn projections. Scraping smooths the surface and gradually corrects irregularities. Repeated passes can reduce a trunk into a carefully tapered form. Modern experiments show that even with good stone tools, shaping a long spear demands patience, strength, and constant attention to symmetry. A small mistake can ruin hours of work. The makers also use splitting, a method requiring a different intelligence. Instead of carving every object from a whole branch or stem, they opened larger pieces along the grain and worked the sections into thinner tools. Splitting can save material, create predictable surfaces, and produce several blanks from one trunk, but it requires knowledge of how wood fractures. A split begun in the wrong place may wander toward a knot or run through the side. The artisan must choose the line, start it carefully, and guide it before the material decides its own path. This ability to read grain is one of the least dramatic and most revealing details at Schöningen. Hunting scenes attract attention, a horse turning at the water, a spear in flight, several hunters closing distance. Yet none of that is possible without quiet technical work performed earlier. The skill lies in fingertips feeling raised fibers, eyes following lines beneath scraped bark, and memory comparing one trunk with many others handled before. Such knowledge is rarely visible in stone because it belongs to perishable material and embodied practice. Season may have mattered. Wood cut at different times contains different amounts of moisture and sap. Fresh green wood is easier to shape but may warp as it dries. Drier wood can be more stable but harder to work and more prone to splitting. Researchers cannot reconstruct every seasoning method used at Schöningen, and the evidence remains incomplete. But some artifacts suggest that controlling straightness and avoiding cracks were important concerns. Later analysis of throwing sticks would strengthen the possibility that wood was dried or managed deliberately before final use. Selection therefore extended beyond choosing a tree. It included deciding which part of the trunk to use, how much curvature could be corrected, where the point should lie relative to the grain, and how mass should be distributed in several long spears. Dense and strong wood was positioned toward the tip. The center of gravity was controlled, giving the weapon handling qualities comparable in broad principle to a modern javelin, though the ancient forms were heavier and built for different purposes. This was not decorative craftsmanship. Balance affected accuracy, penetration, fatigue, and survival. A poorly balanced spear pulls the arm downward, turns unpredictably in flight, and resists quick adjustment at close range. A shaft too thin may flex or break. One too heavy becomes slow and exhausting. The maker solved these problems without standardized measurements, metal tools, or written instructions. The solution was carried in practiced movement. Lift the shaft, rotate it, feel where it settles, scrape again, test again. Knowledge lived in the sequence. The material choices also reveal foresight at a social level. Someone had to know where suitable trees stood and remember routes between woodland and lake. Others may have helped carry long pieces or protect them from damage. Skills could be shared through observation and participation, even though the form of communication remains unknown. Scholars still debate how complex language was among the responsible populations, but the technical tradition implies reliable transmission. Each finished shaft condensed earlier lessons about failed wood, broken points, warped trunks, and successful hunts. By the time a weapon reached the lakeshore, much of the hunt had already happened in the mind. The animal was not yet wounded, perhaps not even visible, but choices had been made about terrain, material, weight, range, and risk. The tree had become a future possibility. Schöningen's hunters mastered more than pursuit. They mastered the patient conversion of landscape into equipment, beginning when one straight trunk was chosen from all the others and judged worthy of becoming a weapon. The chosen trunk was only a beginning. Between raw timber and finished tool lay a sequence of operations so deliberate that the wooden collection at Schöningen can be read almost like a workshop floor. Bark had to be removed, knots and side branches had to be cut away, uneven surfaces were scraped down, raised fibres were smoothed, and the grain was followed rather than fought. Points were shaped gradually, not hacked into existence. Shafts were corrected, tested, and sometimes altered again. The finished weapons preserve the result, but fragments and partly worked pieces reveal the hidden labour behind them. This labour began with reduction. A stone edge can bite deeply into fresh wood, but it dulls, chips, and demands repeated adjustment. The maker must control both tool and timber, keeping the cutting angle shallow enough to remove material without tearing long fibres from the shaft. Heavy chopping is useful early, when bark and projections must be removed. Finer scraping follows, leaving narrow facets that can later be blended into a smoother surface. Each change in technique reflects a change in purpose. Some artifacts show that whole stems were shaped directly. Others were made from split wood, demonstrating a method that could turn one larger trunk into several usable blanks. Splitting along the grain is efficient, but it is not automatic. The initial fracture must be placed carefully. Force applied in stages can guide the opening, yet knots may divert it. A successful split preserves long, strong strands through the finished object. A failed one wastes valuable material. The people at Schöningen understood this difference well. Their work was also sensitive to the internal architecture of the tree. In a spear, The tip must resist crushing and bending at impact. Several weapons were shaped so that stronger wood from near the base of the trunk lay toward the point. This detail is easy to overlook because the finished spear seems symmetrical, but beneath that symmetry lies an intentional use of unequal material. The maker was not merely creating a pointed stick, the maker was arranging strength. The surface mattered as much as the core. Rough fibers increase drag against the hand, catch moisture, and create places where cracks can begin. Scraping and smoothing reduce those weaknesses. The weapons were carefully finished, though not polished for appearance. Their elegance came from function. A straight shaft travels more predictably. A clean grip can be adjusted quickly. A gradual taper controls mass while maintaining strength. Small improvements accumulate until the object behaves differently from an ordinary branch. Modern replicas show that stone tools can produce convincing spear forms, but the process requires time and skill. The difficult part is not simply sharpening one end, it is maintaining alignment over more than 2 meters while removing enough wood to balance the shaft without thinning it dangerously. Every scrape changes the distribution of weight. Every correction on one side may require compensation on another. The weapon is finished only when shape, strength, and handling reach an acceptable compromise. Yet the collection records more than successful production. It preserves breakage, repair, and reuse. Some tools were damaged and then reshaped into smaller implements. A long object that could no longer serve its first purpose might still contain sections of sound. Straight-grained wood. Those sections could be cut away, pointed, flattened, or adapted. Recycling was not a modern virtue projected backward into prehistory. It was a practical response to the cost of obtaining and preparing good material. Repair reveals a similarly disciplined attitude. A cracked or blunted point does not always require replacement of the entire weapon. It can be shortened and resharpened, though doing so changes balance and reach. These decisions require evaluation. The user must recognize whether the flaw is superficial, whether it will spread under impact, and whether the remaining piece justifies further work. What survives suggests that wooden equipment moved through a life cycle, rather than passing directly from manufacture to discard. That life cycle may have included drying or seasoning. Fresh wood contains moisture and is easier to cut, but it can warp as it loses water. A long spear that bends during drying becomes less accurate and harder to control. Later studies of Schöningen's throwing sticks have raised the possibility that some pieces were managed carefully to reduce cracking and distortion. Direct proof of a formal seasoning process remains elusive, but the straightness of the weapons implies that makers understood how wood changes after cutting and knew ways to limit damage. Heat might have been useful in straightening or hardening wood, but caution is necessary. Popular reconstructions often show ancient craftspeople holding spear points over flames as though this were certain. At Schöningen, evidence for controlled fire in the weapon-bearing context has been questioned, and structures once interpreted as hearths have not convinced every researcher. Fire hardening cannot be inserted into the story because it seems plausible. The artifacts demonstrate skilled shaping without requiring a process the site has not securely established. The absence of secure fire evidence makes the workmanship more impressive in a quieter way. Straightening may have depended on selecting better trunks, working with natural grain, controlling moisture, and making slow mechanical corrections. None of these methods leaves an obvious dramatic trace. They belong to accumulated craft knowledge, visible only when many objects are studied together. A single spear might be dismissed as exceptional, Dozens of worked pieces reveal consistent habits. Those habits would have been difficult to invent anew for every hunt. They imply transmission across individuals and probably across generations. A beginner could learn by watching how an experienced maker holds a stone flake, reads a split, or checks balance. Errors would be obvious in use. A shaft that curved, broke, or flew poorly carried its own lesson. Successful forms could be copied, though never mechanically, because every tree differed. Tradition at Schöningen was not a fixed blueprint, but a set of principles applied flexibly to living material. This flexibility appears in the diversity of the collection: long spears, shorter pointed weapons, throwing sticks, split wood implements, and recycled fragments were not produced by one repetitive action. They required different dimensions, balances, and expectations of stress. The same hands may have moved between them, changing technique according to purpose. Hunting technology was part of a broader craft system, and that system rewarded patience as much as strength. The most important stage of manufacture may have been the repeated moment of inspection. The maker pauses, turns the piece, sights along its length, feels the grain, tests the weight, and decides where to remove the next thin shaving. Nothing about that action is spectacular, yet it is where intention becomes form. Long before a horseherd approached the lake, Schöningen's hunters had already practiced the essential discipline of the hunt, observing closely, anticipating consequences, and acting with controlled precision. A finished spear reveals its final test only when it leaves the hand. Until then, straightness, taper, and balance remain promises. At Schöningen, several long weapons were shaped with centers of gravity, suggesting they were not merely heavy lances for close stabbing. Their proportions invited a more difficult possibility: at least some could have been thrown. That idea changed the imagined distance between hunter and prey. A thrusting weapon brings the human body dangerously close to hooves, teeth, muscle, and panic. A projectile creates space, but only if it can be launched accurately, strike with sufficient force, and survive impact. For years, arguments about the weapons depended heavily on form. Researchers compared the ancient shafts with ethnographic spears and modern javelins, examined their mass distribution, and considered how their points might behave against hide and tissue. Yet appearance alone could not settle the question. A well-balanced object may be throwable without having been designed exclusively for throwing. A long spear can serve several roles during one hunt: carried as protection, thrust at close range, cast at a fleeing animal, or used to control movement. The distinction between throwing spear and thrusting lance may therefore be less rigid than modern labels suggest. Experimental archaeology brought the debate into motion. Researchers produced replicas based on the Schöningen weapons, then placed them in the hands of trained javelin athletes. This choice was important. An inexperienced thrower would test only what a novice could do, not what practiced Middle Pleistocene hunters might have achieved after years of use. The athletes learned the heavier rhythm of the replicas, which differed from modern sporting javelins, and launched them toward targets at hunting distances. Results showed hand-thrown wooden spears could travel with useful accuracy and retain enough energy to penetrate a target. Throws near 20 meters were realistic, and greater distances were possible under controlled conditions. The spear did not need to cross a valley or perform like a modern bow. It needed to cover the final space between concealed hunter and animal before the prey could react fully. At close hunting range, a well-delivered cast could carry substantial momentum. The experiments therefore weakened the old assumption that early wooden spears were limited to clumsy, near-contact use, They also revealed how much depended on skill. The weapon's mass can become an advantage at impact but demands strength, timing, and coordination during release. A poor throw wastes energy in wobble. If the shaft leaves the hand at the wrong angle, the point may rise, dive, or turn aside. The thrower must align the body, accelerate smoothly, and release at a moment learned through practice rather than instinct alone. Accuracy declined when technique faltered. Schöningen's weapons could fly, but they did not make successful hunters automatically. This matters because experiments are sometimes summarized too simply. A replica striking a target does not prove that every ancient spear was thrown, nor does it reconstruct an actual hunt. Modern athletes possess specialized training, while ancient hunters possess different experience, perhaps broader but impossible to measure. Targets cannot reproduce the movement of a live horse, vegetation, wind over water, uneven footing, fear, or the need to coordinate with others. Experimental results establish physical plausibility. They do not provide a film of the past. Even so, physical plausibility is powerful. It tells us that the makers invested in properties that could reward practiced throwing. Balance is not decorative. A shaft weighted sensibly around its center is easier to control in flight and faster to orient by hand. A carefully tapered point reduces unnecessary mass at the front while concentrating force. Straight grain helps prevent failure during launch and impact. These same features can aid thrusting, which is why scholars still debate intended use. But together they show that the weapons were designed around performance. The likely hunting distances were intimate by modern standards. 20 meters is the length of a small room multiplied several times, close enough to see an animal's head turn and its muscles tense. A horse can cover that distance quickly. The hunters therefore needed concealment, favorable terrain, or coordination to delay escape. A missed cast could scatter the herd and waste the opportunity. A wounded animal could flee, defend itself, or draw hunters into a difficult pursuit. Throwing reduced some dangers of contact, but it did not make the encounter safe. Practice would have been essential, and practice leaves little archaeological trace. Wooden weapons used for training might break or decay far from preserved sites. Throwing technique lives in muscles and memory, not in stone. Yet the replicas suggest that ancient users could improve through repetition, just as modern throwers did. They may have practiced against trees, banks, carcasses, or moving targets, though no direct evidence identifies a training ground. What survives suggests a technology whose full value emerged only through learned bodily skill. Different hunters may have carried different weapons or used the same forms differently. Stronger individuals could throw heavier shafts effectively, while others might favor shorter weapons, thrusting positions, or roles in driving animals. The Schöningen collection includes more than one size and type, making a single standardized technique unlikely. Hunting may have involved a flexible combination of casts, close approaches, pursuit, and interception. No single explanation fully accounts for every weapon. The wooden points themselves also shape tactical choices. Without a separate stone tip, the sharpened shaft relied on geometry, hardness, velocity, and the vulnerable areas of the animal. A cast into thick bone might fail where one entering behind a shoulder could penetrate deeply. Successful use therefore required knowledge of anatomy as well as throwing. Hunters processing many horses would learn where muscle thickened, where ribs opened paths inward, and where a strike could disable movement. That knowledge could feed back into aim and weapon design. The experiments restore motion to artifacts that reached archaeologists in silence. In museum cases, the spears lie straight and still, their surfaces darkened by age. In the hand, even as replicas, they become dynamic objects requiring stance, judgment, and commitment. The throw begins in the legs, passes through the torso and shoulder, and ends in a release that cannot be called back. For a moment, the weapon crosses open air as its maker intended it to do, or at least as one plausible use allowed. Whether every long spear at Schöningen flew remains unresolved. Some may have been thrust, some may have served both purposes as circumstances required. The safest conclusion is not that researchers have identified one universal method, but that these weapons offered more capability than once assumed. They could carry force beyond arm's reach, and trained users could direct that force with meaningful accuracy. The artistry of the hunt therefore extended beyond shaping wood. It included mastering the brief, irreversible instant when balance, strength, distance, and judgment came together, and the spear left the hand. Long spears dominate imagination because they contain the drama of a hunt, a human arm, a rushing animal, and a point moving through open air. But Schöningen preserved another kind of weapon, shorter, stranger, and easier to underestimate. Several carefully shaped throwing sticks lay within that wooden world. They were pointed at both ends, curved or slightly asymmetrical, and designed not as crude clubs but as controlled projectiles. Their presence widens the hunt from a single decisive cast to a more flexible system of movement, pressure, distraction, and pursuit. A throwing stick is one of the oldest weapon forms that can hide in plain sight. At first glance, it may resemble an ordinary branch modified only slightly by human hands, yet close analysis reveals choices in species, curvature, grain, surface treatment, mass distribution, and tip shaping. At Schöningen, microscopy, scanning, and microcomputed tomography. Exposed traces ordinary inspection could miss. The makers removed bark, scraped surfaces, trimmed knots, and adjusted profiles carefully. These objects were engineered for repeated handling and flight. Their double-pointed design is revealing. A weapon with two tapered ends does not depend on one permanently forward tip. It can rotate in flight and still present a dangerous edge, depending on shape and release. Such a stick may travel in a spinning path, strike with considerable force, or skim low through vegetation. It is not identical to the returning boomerang familiar from popular culture, and there is no reason to imagine that Schöningen's hunters expected it to circle back. Its value lay in reach, impact, unpredictability, and versatility. One studied example appears to have been made with care. Its grain was followed closely, surfaces were finely worked, and internal features suggest that the wood had been selected to minimize weaknesses. Researchers have proposed that it may have been dried or otherwise managed to reduce warping and cracking. That possibility remains cautious rather than certain, but it fits the broader pattern of material knowledge seen across the assemblage. A short weapon was not treated as disposable, simply because it required less wood than a spear. What, then, was it used against small and medium-sized animals offer one possibility. Birds rising from reeds, hares breaking from cover, and other fast prey can be difficult to approach with a long spear. A spinning stick thrown across their path may strike directly, stun, injure, or alter their movement. Ethnographic comparisons show that throwing sticks can work in open ground and wetlands when hunters understand where animals turn, yet direct analogy must remain limited. Similar forms can serve different purposes, and shape alone cannot explain their use history. They may also have played a role in hunts for larger animals. A projectile does not need to kill a horse to influence it. A stick landing nearby, striking the legs, or passing suddenly through the herd could cause individuals to veer, bunch together, or move toward waiting hunters. In a coordinated drive, some participants might create pressure while others held spears at likely escape routes. This interpretation is plausible because large animal hunting often depends less on overpowering prey than on controlling direction. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, and the sticks may have served several functions. The existence of multiple weapon types makes the Schöningen hunters more difficult to imagine as people relying on one simple method. Long spears offered penetration and reach. Shorter projectiles offered speed, portability, and rapid use. A hunter could carry more than one throwing stick without the burden of several full-length shafts. Such weapons might be launched in succession, used while moving, or held after a spear had been cast. Their compact size also suited woodland edges and reed zones where long weapons could catch on vegetation. The lakeside setting rewarded flexibility. Animals approached water by different routes. Some crossed open patches where distance weapons were useful. Others moved through cover, shallow margins, or uneven ground. Birds and small mammals occupied the same environment as horses and larger game. A varied toolkit allowed people to exploit opportunities that did not fit one narrow hunting plan. The site therefore records not only specialization in horse hunting, but broader readiness within a productive landscape. Skill again stood between object and result. A throwing stick must be released with controlled spin, angle, and force. Too little rotation can make it tumble badly. Too steep an angle wastes energy upward. A poor grip sends it sideways. Experienced users learn how curvature interacts with air resistance and how a low cast behaves above ground. The physics can be described today, but the ancient knowledge was embodied. It lived in repeated motion, correction, and memory. Practice may have been social. One person could observe another's stance, timing, and release. Younger group members could learn handling through safe, supervised practice, though such instruction leaves no direct archaeological trace. What matters is that a complex projectile tradition cannot persist through accident alone. It requires reliable transmission. The weapon's form and the body's technique must meet each other across generations. The making process also connects throwing sticks to the larger wooden economy. Their curved forms may have begun with naturally suitable branches rather than straight trunks. The craftsperson had to distinguish useful curvature from weakness, preserve strength around bends, and shape both ends without cutting through critical fibers. Surface smoothing reduced splinters and improved grip. Weight had to be sufficient for impact but low enough for rapid acceleration. These are different problems from those posed by a 2-meter spear, showing that Schöningen's woodworkers could adapt their methods rather than repeat one familiar design. Wear and damage may preserve hints of repeated use. Although interpreting them is difficult, an impact scar could result from striking prey, ground, wood, or another hard surface. Burial pressure can imitate ancient fractures. Researchers therefore compare microscopic features and internal cracks before making claims. The evidence remains incomplete, but the care invested in manufacture suggests that at least some throwing sticks were maintained equipment, not casual missiles. Their presence changes the emotional scale of the hunt. The spear evokes the final approach, when distance collapses and danger becomes immediate. The throwing stick belongs to the wider choreography, flushing, redirecting, testing range, exploiting surprise, and responding when animals move unexpectedly. It reminds us that successful hunting is rarely one heroic gesture. It is a sequence of small decisions made by several people under changing conditions. Schöningen's hunters did not master one weapon and stop. They developed a family of wooden technologies suited to different distances, targets, and tasks. The double-pointed throwing sticks reveal imagination operating inside constraint. A branch becomes a projectile not because it is thrown, but because shape, balance, grain, and handling have been deliberately brought together. Beneath the mine, these shorter weapons stand beside the famous spears as evidence that the ancient hunt was already varied, practiced, and technically sophisticated. The weapons become more than feats of woodworking when the bones beside them begin to speak. Schöningen yielded the remains of many horses, most commonly identified with an extinct form often called Equus mosbachensis. These were not small, delicate animals waiting passively at the water. They were powerful, alert herd mammals built for speed, with strong limbs, heavy muscles, and senses sharpened by predators. Approaching them closely required patience. Killing them required skill. Processing them required still more labor after the danger had passed. Horse bones from the spear horizon carry cut marks made by stone tools. Fine slices appear where hide was opened. Muscles were removed and joints were separated. Other marks record disarticulation and the stripping of usable tissue. Fractures may reflect access to marrow or the practical reduction of large carcasses into manageable portions. The pattern does not resemble random damage produced by sediment alone. It reflects repeated contact between sharp edges and animal bodies, preserving the quieter work that followed pursuit. Zooarchaeologists read these traces cautiously. Carnivores can scatter bones, water can move them, and trampling can alter surfaces. A concentration of horse remains does not automatically prove a human kill. Animals may die naturally near water, become trapped in mud, or be found after other predators have fed. For decades, such alternatives shaped arguments about whether early humans were hunters or scavengers. Schöningen mattered because the wooden weapons, stone tools, carcass processing marks, and spatial associations appeared together. No single clue carried the case alone. Their convergence made active hunting increasingly difficult to dismiss. A detailed reassessment of the faunal evidence strengthened that interpretation. The horses were not merely represented by isolated scraps selected from abandoned carcasses. Body parts indicate that substantial portions of animals were available to the people working at the site. Cut marks occur in places consistent with early access to flesh, rather than only the removal of leftovers. The hunters seem to have encountered relatively complete carcasses and processed them where the animals fell or very nearby. What survives in the record suggests primary access, although the precise death of every individual cannot be reconstructed. This distinction is important. Scavenging is not evidence of inferiority. It can require knowledge, courage, and speed. But regular access to fresh, complete horses implies a different relationship with the landscape. The humans were not simply waiting for chance. They understood when herds approached the lake, how animals moved along its margins, and where terrain could shorten the distance between prey and weapon. They returned often enough for bones, tools, and wooden equipment to accumulate within the same broad setting. The horses themselves reveal why cooperation was valuable. A single carcass offered a large quantity of meat, fat, organs, hide, sinew, and possibly bone for immediate or later use. Yet that abundance created a deadline. Meat spoils. Carnivores detect blood and exposed tissue. Weather changes. A group had to work efficiently, dividing tasks among cutting, guarding, carrying, and maintaining tools. The evidence cannot identify individual roles, but the scale of processing makes a solitary hunter difficult to imagine as the normal pattern. Even a successful kill could become a failure if the meat was not recovered quickly. So hunting competence included logistics, endurance, cooperation, and decisions about what the group could carry. Butchery was not one simple action. Hide had to be opened without wasting useful skin. Major muscles could be removed in heavy sections. Limbs had to be separated at joints, where anatomical knowledge saved effort and protected stone edges. Tendons and connective tissues resisted cutting differently from flesh. A practiced butcher knew where to place a blade and how to use body weight. These skills would have grown through repeated encounters with large animals, turning anatomy into remembered geography. Stone tools performed much of this close work, while wooden implements may have assisted in ways now harder to identify. A pointed tool could hold tissue apart, loosen joints, move hot or bloody material, or help with tasks that leave ambiguous wear. Splitwood tools may have served during processing, although assigning exact functions remains difficult. The important point is that the hunt continued after the animal stopped moving. Weapons secured access. An entire toolkit converted the carcass into food and materials. Not every horse at Schöningen necessarily died in the same way. Some may have been struck by thrown spears, others dispatched at close range, and some perhaps encountered under unusual conditions at the wet margin. The lake could slow movement or channel animals, but it could also complicate human footing. Scholars still debate the exact relationship between the finds and the shifting shoreline. Simple reconstructions of a herd driven into a fixed trap may promise more certainty than the sediments allow. The age profile of the animals offers another layer. Hunting decisions may have favoured individuals that could be separated from a herd, but the record does not reduce neatly to only weak or very young prey. The people involved were capable of obtaining substantial animals with meaningful nutritional return. This does not mean every attempt succeeded. Failed hunts usually leave fewer traces than successful ones. Archaeology records the moments when tools, bones, and sediment happen to meet, not the many empty hours of tracking and waiting. Seasonality may also have shaped repeated visits. Horses follow forage and water conditions, and their routes can become predictable during certain parts of the year. Hunters familiar with the lake could anticipate when herds were most likely to appear. Insects, plants, sediments, and animal remains offer pieces of the environmental calendar, but no single reconstruction fixes every hunting event to one season. What can be said is that the lakeside was not chosen at random. It was a place where animal movement and human knowledge intersected. The image that emerges is less theatrical than a mass charge and more impressive for that reason. A few hunters wait in cover or move carefully along the margin. Others position themselves where a horse may turn. A weapon is cast or driven forward at close range. The herd breaks away. Then the group gathers around one animal and begins the long work of cutting, lifting, separating, and carrying. This scene may have occurred more than once, altered by weather, water level, group size, and opportunity. The horsebones anchor the wooden technology in consequence. A balanced spear is evidence of design. A butchered carcass shows what such design could help obtain. Together they reveal hunters who understood both living movement and dead anatomy. They knew the behavior of herds before contact and the structure of muscle and bone afterward. The art of the hunt lay not only in bringing down prey, but in reading the entire animal from distant silhouette to divided carcass, and in returning to the lake often enough for that knowledge to become tradition. The horse bones once encouraged an almost irresistible picture, a single catastrophic hunt in which an entire herd was driven, trapped, and killed beside the lake. It is easy to see why. Numerous remains lie within the same archaeological horizon, accompanied by weapons and tools. A mass event offers drama, clarity, and a clean explanation for abundance. Yet the more closely Schöningen has been studied, the less securely that picture holds. The site now appears to record repeated episodes of hunting, butchery, repair, and tool use, accumulating through time rather than one overwhelming slaughter. This change does not make the hunters less capable. It makes their achievement more durable. One successful ambush can result from rare circumstances. Returning to the same landscape, reading it accurately, and obtaining horses on multiple occasions suggests knowledge maintained across seasons and visits. The lakeside was not simply the scene of an extraordinary accident. It was part of a familiar hunting territory where people understood water levels, animal routes, patches of cover, and the practical demands of processing large carcasses. Recent work on the faunal remains emphasizes that the horses may represent a sequence of relatively small kills. Individuals or limited groups of animals were taken at different moments, then butchered in or near the place where they fell. Sediment gradually combined these episodes into an archaeological concentration that can look simultaneous when viewed after hundreds of thousands of years. The evidence remains incomplete, and the exact number and spacing of events cannot be recovered. But no single explanation fully accounts for the variation in bones, tools, and depositional conditions as well as repeated use does. The difference between event time and geological time is central. Human activity may unfold over hours, while a sedimentary unit can gather material over years, decades, or longer. When later deposits compress that record, separate visits can appear to occupy one surface. Water complicates matters further by shifting light objects, redistributing fragments, and covering some areas before others. Archaeologists therefore resist treating every spear, horse bone, and split wood tool as if it were dropped during the same hunt. Patterns of preservation support this caution. Not every carcass was processed identically. Some bones are better represented than others. Cut marks, fractures, and anatomical distributions suggest variation in what was removed, what was left, and how thoroughly different animals were exploited. Such differences may reflect group size, time pressure, season, carcass condition, or the distance meat had to be carried. They may also represent changing objectives. On one visit, hunters might prioritize high-value muscle. On another, they might spend longer extracting marrow, hide, tendons, or other materials. The wooden artifacts strengthen the image of a multifunctional place. Beside the weapons were split wood implements, damaged pieces, production debris, and objects that had been repaired or converted to new uses. These are not the traces expected from a group that arrived only for a brief attack and immediately departed. They suggest time spent maintaining equipment and carrying out ordinary tasks. Hunting remained central, but it existed within a broader rhythm of work. That rhythm may have begun before animals appeared. Hunters could prepare or inspect weapons while waiting near known routes. A damaged point could be reshaped. A shaft might be scraped to improve its surface. Smaller tools could be made from fragments brought from elsewhere or generated during repair. Once a horse was obtained, attention shifted to butchery. Afterward, usable wood might be collected, altered, or carried away. The site functioned not as a formal camp in the later architectural sense, but as a repeatedly used activity area where different tasks overlapped. The term hunting camp can therefore be useful only if handled carefully. There is no secure evidence of dwellings, long-term structures, or a permanent settlement at the spear horizon, nor is there proof that large groups remained for extended periods. The frequently wet setting may have discouraged prolonged occupation, yet people could use a place intensively without living there continuously. A shoreline visited for hours or days during favourable conditions could accumulate a rich record if the visits recurred. Repeated use also changes how cooperation should be understood. A single mass kill might imply unusually large coordination, perhaps involving many participants driving a herd. Smaller hunts could have been managed by more modest groups, with several hunters positioning themselves around one or a few animals. This requires cooperation, but not necessarily a vast communal operation. The evidence supports planning and shared action, without allowing a precise head count. The horses may have learned the landscape as well. Herds returning to water follow inherited and remembered routes, but they are alert to disturbance. Repeated human hunting could make certain approaches less effective over time. Hunters would need to adjust concealment, timing, and position rather than repeat one fixed trick. The art of the hunt is not a recipe applied mechanically. It is an exchange of perception between predator and prey, each responding to the other. Seasonal change added further variation. A grassy margin in one part of the year could become muddy or flooded in another. Woodland cover thickened and thinned. Winds shifted scent across open water. Herd composition changed as animals moved, bred, and followed forage. People familiar with the lake could return when conditions favoured them, but the same strategy would not work every time. What survives suggests repeated decision-making inside a changing environment. This longer history may explain why so many different objects reached the sediment. Some were lost during action. Others were discarded because they broke or no longer justified repair. A few may have been left temporarily and never recovered. Water then preserved what human beings had no reason to value further. The archaeological collection is therefore not a complete toolkit placed deliberately in storage. It is the residue of selection what was abandoned, overlooked, broken, or trapped by the landscape. There is a quiet realism in this interpretation. Schöningen need not depend on one spectacular day to remain extraordinary. Its importance lies in recurrence. Hunters came back because the place worked. They understood enough about horses, wood, stone, water, and one another to turn opportunity into food more than once. Each visit added another thin layer of evidence, until geology folded those moments together beneath the future coal mine. The old image of a single massacre survives because it offers a sharp scene. The newer picture is less cinematic at first glance, but more revealing. It shows knowledge tested repeatedly rather than displayed once. Spears were made, used, repaired, and sometimes lost. Horses were approached, killed, and processed in separate episodes. Tools passed through several lives. The lakeshore became meaningful through memory. Schöningen was not simply where a hunt happened. It was a place hunters knew well enough to trust again. And that trust may have lasted across many human generations. Memory made the lakeshore useful, but the shore itself never remained still. The phrase Ice Age hunters can suggest a world locked beneath snow, where every breath freezes and every horizon is white. Schöningen belonged to the Pleistocene, an age marked by repeated glacial advances and retreats. Yet the weapon-bearing landscape was not a permanent tundra. The ancient basin passed through changing phases of open grassland, wet margins, woodland, and relatively mild conditions. At times, trees grew densely enough to provide shade and concealment. At others, cooler and more open environments allowed herds to range across broad ground near the water. The hunters lived not in one frozen scene, but inside a climate that changed at scales both slow and immediate. Sediments beneath the coal mine preserved this environmental movement in thin layers, pollen records which plants released grains into the air. Beetles and other insects carry narrow tolerances for temperature and habitat, allowing researchers to estimate whether summers were cool, mild, or surprisingly warm. Mollusks reflect water conditions. Plant remains indicate the presence of reeds, grasses, shrubs, and trees. None of these clues provides a perfect thermometer, and local conditions can differ from regional climate, but together they reconstruct a lake whose surroundings change repeatedly rather than remaining fixed. Recent paleoenvironmental work has refined estimates of temperature and lake development. Some phases appear to have supported summer conditions comfortable enough for extensive vegetation, while others were cooler and more open. The precise sequence depends partly on the disputed age of the spear horizon. If the weapons belong near 300,000 years ago, they may sit within a different interglacial framework than if they are closer to 200,000 years old. This uncertainty reaches beyond dating. It changes which climate cycle, animal community, and regional landscape should surround the hunters. Scholars still debate the correlation, and every reconstruction must leave room for that moving foundation. Whatever the final age proves to be, the evidence rejects the easy image of humans struggling through constant blizzards. Horses needed forage, and the lake attracted them because the surrounding environment could sustain substantial herbivore populations. Other large mammals also moved through the region. Woodland offered raw material and cover. Open areas provided grass and visibility. Wet ground concentrated tracks and movement around reliable water. The landscape could be demanding without being uniformly hostile. Seasonal change mattered more directly than distant climate cycles. Spring growth altered where animals grazed. Summer water levels exposed or covered portions of the margin. Autumn changed the quality of forage and the condition of herds. Winter could harden ground, thin vegetation, and make some routes easier to predict. Wind carried scent differently across open water and through trees. Rain softened sediments underfoot. Fog reduced visibility. Hunters who returned repeatedly needed to understand not only where the lake lay, but how it behaved through the year. The animals understood these patterns in their own way. Horses sought water, grazing, and secure routes between open ground and shelter. They avoided deep mud where possible and watched for movement near cover. A shoreline that favored an ambush during one season might become useless when flooded. A wooded approach could conceal hunters until leaves fell. Knowledge of the place therefore required continual revision. Memory was valuable only when joined to observation. The lake itself evolved over longer periods. Water expanded, contracted, and shifted position as sediment accumulated and hydrology changed. Areas that later appeared to be a single shore may have alternated between dry land, shallow water, reed bed, and saturated mud. This is why simple illustrations of hunters waiting on one stable bank can mislead. the archaeological horizon formed within a dynamic basin. Some artifacts may have been deposited on exposed surfaces and later flooded. Others may have entered shallow water directly. Light pieces could move short distances before burial. The exact route from human hand to final sediment is not always recoverable. These uncertainties do not erase behavior, but they complicate choreography. A horse slowed by wet ground is easier to approach, yet a hunter can also slip or lose leverage. Reeds provide concealment, but they obstruct a long spear. Open grass improves visibility for both predator and prey. Woodland edges create opportunities for surprise while limiting throwing distance. Every advantage carries a cost. The successful hunters were not masters because the landscape handed them helpless animals. They were masters because they learned how to use imperfect circumstances. Vegetation also shaped the wooden technology. Spruce and other conifers used for weapons may not have grown directly beside every activity area. Their presence in the toolkit suggests movement between ecological zones or transport from stands located elsewhere. The hunters crossed a mosaic rather than occupying one uniform habitat. They knew where straight trunks could be found, where horses gathered, and where water created predictable passages. A spear joined these separate places into one plan. The same mosaic supported more than hunting. Plant foods, fuel, fibers, bark, and smaller animals may have been available, though preservation and research do not reveal every part of the diet. It would be a mistake to imagine that horse meat was the only resource that mattered, simply because horse bones dominate the dramatic evidence. Human groups survive through combinations of opportunities. Large kills provided rich returns, but gathering, scavenging, small game hunting, and plant use probably formed part of the wider economy. What survives at Schöningen is unusually detailed, yet still selective. The phrase Ice Age can also conceal the speed of ecological transformation. Over generations, forests could advance or retreat, animal ranges shifted, familiar routes disappeared. Groups had to carry knowledge forward while accepting that yesterday's landscape might not return exactly. This ability to adapt is visible indirectly in the varied toolkit. Long spears, throwing sticks, and domestic implements suited different tasks and conditions. Technical flexibility answered environmental instability. There may have been moments of severe cold, hunger, and dangerous weather, but the site should not be staged beneath endless storm clouds. Imagine instead a pale morning mist lifting from water, damp grass bending under hoofprints, and patches of woodland dark along the basin edge. In summer, insects gather above the shallows. In cooler months, the air sharpens and open ground expands. The hunters wait inside a living landscape whose colours, sounds, and possibilities change with the season. That setting makes their achievement more intelligible. They did not conquer a dead, frozen world through brute endurance alone. They learned a responsive world. They watched water, plants, wind, and animals, then adjusted movement and equipment accordingly. The lake was never merely a backdrop for the spears. Its instability rewarded attention, patience, and the willingness to abandon a failing plan. It was an active part of the hunting system, generous at one moment, obstructive at another, and always changing beneath the long rhythms of Pleistocene climate. The changing shoreline does more than complicate the scenery. It challenges one of the most familiar reconstructions of Schöningen hunters standing on firm ground at the edge of a lake, waiting for horses to pass before launching their spears. That image is possible in broad outline, but the sediments refuse to support it as a simple, fixed scene. Much of the weapon-bearing material lay within zones that were repeatedly wet, shallowly flooded, or saturated. The ancient surface was not one clean bank. It was a shifting margin where water advanced, retreated, and rearranged the conditions under which animals and people moved. Sediment studies show that several finds accumulated in environments affected by standing water or periodic inundation. This matters because an artifact's final position may not be identical to the place where it was used or dropped. A spear could have fallen onto wet ground and later settled into mud. A lighter wooden fragment might have floated a short distance before becoming waterlogged. Bones could shift as water levels changed, while heavier objects remained closer to their original positions. The evidence does not suggest transport that erased human associations, but it warns against treating every object as if it remained exactly where a hunter released it. This shoreline problem also changes the mechanics of the hunt. Wet ground can slow a horse, especially if the animal enters mud unexpectedly, but it can also slow a human. A hunter throwing from unstable footing loses power and accuracy. A person attempting to thrust a spear at close range needs leverage, balance, and room to move. Reeds and shallow water can hide approach, yet they can catch a long shaft or reveal movement through sound. What looks like a natural trap may have been dangerous for everyone involved. For this reason, scholars still debate whether the lake margin itself functioned as the decisive hunting feature. Perhaps horses were intercepted near the water but on firmer patches. Perhaps hunters used routes leading toward the basin rather than the wettest edge. Perhaps some animals were wounded elsewhere and processed where water and visibility made butchery practical. Repeated visits could have involved different shoreline positions as conditions changed. No single explanation fully accounts for the deposits, and the most reliable reconstruction is a flexible one. The evidence for fire introduces a second complication. Early descriptions of Schöningen included darkened sediment and features interpreted as hearths, encouraging a vivid picture of hunters warming themselves, roasting meat, and maintaining flames beside the kill area. Fire would fit comfortably into a story of planned occupation. It offers heat, light, protection, cooking, and help in working materials. Yet later analysis has questioned whether the supposed hearths truly resulted from controlled burning. Dark coloration can form through natural chemical processes in wet sediments. Burned-looking material may be altered by mineral staining. Charcoal can move from older or younger deposits. Heat-fractured stone requires careful comparison because pressure, weathering, and sediment movement can imitate some effects of fire. When researchers revisited the Schöningen features, the case for secure hearths in the spear horizon became less certain. The site may contain traces of burning, but evidence for deliberate maintained fire at the weapon-bearing level is not universally accepted. This uncertainty matters because controlled fire is often treated as a sign of cognitive and social sophistication, but the hunter's abilities do not depend on forcing a hearth into the scene. They selected timber, manufactured balanced weapons, coordinated around large animals, and processed carcasses with skill. Those behaviors remain visible whether or not flames burned nearby. Fire would expand the toolkit, but its absence from the secure record would not reduce the complexity already demonstrated. It also affects interpretations of weapon manufacture. Popular accounts sometimes assume that wooden points were hardened in fire or that shafts were heated to straighten them. Both techniques are plausible, but Schöningen does not provide firm proof that they were used here. The craftsmanship can be explained through species selection, grain control, scraping, moisture management, and mechanical correction. Adding fire where the evidence is uncertain would make the story feel complete at the cost of accuracy. The debate reveals a larger archaeological habit. Once a dramatic interpretation takes hold, it can persist because it links scattered evidence into a satisfying scene. Spears, horse bones, and a hearth create an almost cinematic camp. Yet science advances by taking that scene apart and asking whether every element is equally secure. Some are. The wooden artifacts are undeniable. Butchery marks are well documented. The association with horse remains is strong. The exact surface on which people stood, the role of water during deposition, and the presence of controlled fire remain more difficult. This does not mean the site dissolves into uncertainty. Distinguishing strong evidence from weaker inference makes the central story more reliable. People repeatedly worked wooden tools and processed large animals at Schöningen. The deposits preserve a complex relationship between human activity and a lake margin environment. Water played a role both during occupation and after abandonment. Fire may have been present, but no secure reconstruction should depend on it. There is also a practical reason people might have used the area without building enduring hearths. If visits were short and focused on hunting and carcass processing, groups may not always have needed a long-lived fire. Activities could have occurred during favourable daylight and mild seasons. Meat could be transported away for consumption elsewhere. A fire might have been made on a drier surface beyond the excavated zone, leaving no trace within the spear horizon. Absence of evidence in one locality is not proof that the hunters lacked fire generally. The wet setting may even explain why some tools were abandoned. An object dropped in shallow water can disappear immediately beneath cloudy sediment. A spear damaged during a struggle might be left where recovery was risky. Small wooden tools could sink into mud and become impossible to find. The same conditions that frustrate modern interpretation may have frustrated ancient people in the moment. Their losses became archaeology because water concealed them quickly. Schöningen therefore resists the neatness of a single tableau. The hunters were not arranged around a guaranteed hearth on a permanent dry bank. They operated within a landscape of unstable footing, changing water, uncertain visibility, and incomplete control. Their competence appears not in conquering those conditions completely, but in returning despite them. They knew enough to exploit the lake without ever making it predictable. This is a more demanding image of mastery. It replaces the certainty of one perfect ambush with repeated judgment under imperfect circumstances. The shore shifted. The fire evidence remains contested. Objects moved after deposition. Yet through all that uncertainty, the pattern of human intention survives. Spears were made, animals were butchered, tools were maintained, and knowledge was applied again and again beside water that never held still. The people behind the weapons remain the most compelling absence at Schöningen. Their tools survive with extraordinary clarity. Their prey survives in butchered bone. Their movements can be inferred from repeated visits to the lake, their planning from selected timber, and their skill from balanced shafts and carefully worked throwing sticks. Yet no human fossil has been recovered directly from the spear horizon. There is no skull, tooth, or fragment of limb bone that can be placed securely beside the weapons and declared to belong to their makers. The site preserves behavior more vividly than identity. For many years, the conventional age of roughly 300,000 years encouraged researchers to associate the weapons with Homo heidelbergensis, a broad and sometimes inconsistently used name for Middle Pleistocene humans in Europe. In other accounts, the makers were described as early Neanderthals, or as populations close to the Neanderthal lineage. These labels can create an impression of certainty that the evidence does not support. Human evolution during this period was not a tidy sequence of clearly bounded species replacing one another. Populations changed across regions, mixed, separated, and developed traits at different rates. The names used by scientists are tools for organizing that complexity, not tags found attached to ancient individuals. If the spear horizon is closer to 200,000 years old, as one major study proposed in 2025, Neanderthals become a more likely candidate. By that time, populations with distinctly Neanderthal anatomy were established in Europe. If the older placement near 300,000 years remains correct, the makers may belong to an earlier stage of the same broad lineage or to a population commonly grouped under Homo heidelbergensis. The weapons were deposited somewhere between roughly 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, although their exact age remains actively debated. Until that dispute is settled, assigning the artifacts to one named human group risks turning a possibility into a fact. Even a secure date might not solve everything. Fossils from the European Middle Pleistocene display mosaics of traits rather than one uniform anatomy. A jaw can look more Neanderthal-like in one feature and less so in another. Regional groups may have differed while remaining connected through migration and interbreeding. Genetic evidence from later Neanderthals shows that their history involved population contractions, expansions, and contact with other humans. Schöningen's hunters stood somewhere within that complicated ancestry, but the wooden weapons cannot reveal the exact shape of their faces. What they can reveal is at least as important. Older interpretations often linked technological sophistication too closely to species labels. If Homo sapiens made an object, complexity was expected. If an earlier human made it, the same object was sometimes treated as surprising. Schöningen reverses that logic. The behavior must be understood first. Whoever the makers were, they selected raw material carefully, produced several forms of wooden tools, hunted large animals, and returned to a productive landscape repeatedly. Their competence is demonstrated directly and does not depend on whether a taxonomist calls them Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, or something more cautious. This is especially relevant to the history of Neanderthal research. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, Neanderthals were portrayed as brutish, slow, and culturally limited. Their heavy bones and pronounced brow ridges were made to carry assumptions about intelligence. Later discoveries revealed more adaptable hunters, skilled stoneworkers, users of fire in many contexts, and populations able to survive across varied European environments. Schöningen entered this changing debate by showing that humans before Homo sapiens could manufacture high-performance wooden weapons, whether the makers were fully Neanderthal or belonged to an earlier related population. The old boundary between primitive scavenger and organized hunter became harder to defend. The absence of human remains also prevents assumptions about group composition. Archaeology cannot tell whether the hunting parties included only a few adults or a larger community divided among different tasks. It cannot identify sex, age, rank, or individual expertise from the weapons alone. Different people may have specialized in selecting trees, shaping shafts, tracking horses, driving animals, or butchering carcasses. Such divisions are plausible because the work was varied, but they remain inference. What survives in the record suggests cooperation without revealing the exact social arrangement behind it. Communication presents a similar problem. Coordinated hunting benefits from shared signals, anticipation, and the ability to assign or recognize roles. This does not prove language identical to modern speech, and no artifact can preserve grammar. Yet a stable tradition of woodworking and repeated group hunting implies effective transmission of information. Techniques had to pass between individuals. Hunters had to respond to one another as prey moved. Plans could be simple or elaborate, but they could not remain entirely private inside one mind. The makers also possessed a body adapted to demanding movement, carrying long shafts, throwing heavy weapons, controlling them at close range, and processing horse carcasses required strength and endurance. Middle Pleistocene Europeans were generally robust, though the precise anatomy of the Schöningen population is unknown. Their physical power should not be imagined as a substitute for planning. Strength without timing would scatter a herd. Endurance without anatomical knowledge would waste a carcass. The tools show bodies and judgment working together. There is a temptation to restore the missing people too completely. Artists often choose a familiar reconstruction: broad faces, heavy brows, fur clothing, and a group arranged dramatically around a horse. Such images can help audiences grasp scale, but every detail carries uncertainty. Clothing rarely survives. Hair and skin cannot be recovered from the site. Facial form depends on which population is assumed. Even the number of hunters is unknown. A responsible reconstruction must therefore remain slightly open, emphasizing action and environment while admitting that appearance is largely concealed. That concealment may be one reason the spears exert such power. They are intimate objects without owners. A shaft records hand pressure, repeated scraping, and decisions about balance, but not the name or face of the person who made it. One weapon may have been shaped by an expert and carried by someone else. Another may have been repaired after several hunts. The artifacts preserve relationships among people, even when they cannot preserve individuals. The identity question will continue to attract debate because a species name seems to promise resolution. Yet Schöningen's deeper lesson is that behavior does not wait for classification. Long before modern humans dominated Europe, another human population had already learned to transform selected trees into a varied hunting technology. They understood horses, water, grain, distance, impact, and cooperation. Their exact place on the family tree remains uncertain, but their place in the history of skill is secure. The anonymous makers beneath the coal mine are not shadows because science has failed to name them. They are shadows because the Pleistocene preserved what their hands did while withholding almost everything about who they were. The anonymous makers cannot be named until the ground beneath them is dated with greater confidence. And in 2025, the chronology of Schöningen shifted sharply. A study published in Science Advances argued that the spear horizon was not about 300,000 years old, as long accepted, but closer to 200,000. The difference is not a minor adjustment. It moves the weapons into another climatic interval, changes which human populations are most plausible, and alters the evolutionary story attached to repeated horse hunting. For a site so often used to define early hunting ability, 100,000 years is an immense distance. The new argument relied on amino acid geochronology. Proteins preserved within shells and other biological tissues gradually change after death. Certain amino acids convert from one molecular form to another through a process called racemization. The rate is influenced by time, temperature, burial history, and the biological material being tested. By measuring these changes in well-understood samples and comparing them with dated sequences, researchers can estimate where an undated deposit belongs within a regional chronology. At Schöningen, the team analysed fossils from layers associated with the archaeological sequence, including animal remains and the small protective lids, or opercula, of freshwater snails. These opercula are valuable because their mineral structure can preserve amino acids within a relatively closed system. They may look insignificant beside a complete wooden spear, but tiny shells can sometimes carry chronological information that spectacular artifacts cannot. The results were compared across the local stratigraphy and with reference material from other European deposits. The study concluded that the spear horizon was best placed near marine isotope stage 7, commonly abbreviated as MS7, an interglacial complex dating broadly around 240,000 to 190,000 years ago. Within that framework, the researchers favoured an age near 200,000 years for the main hunting deposits. The data aligned the site more closely with a period when Neanderthals were established in Europe, making them stronger candidates for the manufacture and use of the wooden weapons. This proposal attracted immediate attention because it appeared to simplify one mystery while creating another. If the weapons were about 200,000 years old, the makers could be discussed more comfortably within Neanderthal behavioral evolution. Repeated horse hunting, woodworking, repair, and cooperative carcass processing would then form part of an increasingly rich picture of Neanderthal adaptability. The site would remain extraordinary, but it would no longer stand quite as early in the history of high-performance hunting technology. The study also re-examined the character of the horse accumulation. Rather than presenting the bones as one mass death event, it interpreted them as evidence for repeated hunts carried out over time. In this view, small groups repeatedly used their knowledge of the lakeside to obtain horses, process carcasses, and maintain equipment. The behavioral significance lies not in one spectacular slaughter, but in persistence. Hunters returned, remembered, coordinated, and adapted their methods across multiple episodes. Some researchers connected this pattern with the social capacities of Neanderthals. Repeated hunting of large, mobile animals requires reliable cooperation, whether the group used thrown spears, thrusting weapons, driving tactics, or a combination of methods. It also requires knowledge to be transferred. Routes, seasons, animal behavior, woodworking procedures, and butchery techniques cannot benefit a community unless individuals learn from one another. A younger date, therefore, places Schöningen within debates about how Neanderthal groups organized labor and maintained traditions. Yet the method does not produce a simple calendar date like a written inscription. Amino acid racemization depends on assumptions about thermal history and sample behavior. Different species and tissues may preserve their internal chemistry differently. Water movement, burial temperature, and later geological disturbance can affect the system. Researchers use controls and comparisons to reduce these uncertainties, but the resulting age model remains an interpretation built from several lines of evidence rather than a direct reading from a clock. The relationship between the tested samples and the precise weapon-bearing surface also demands care. A geological sequence can contain erosion, reworking, and local variation. Material from one layer may not always represent the exact moment when every artifact entered the sediment. The 2025 team argued that the stratigraphic associations supported its revised chronology, but not every specialist accepted that the new measurements outweighed the older biostratigraphic and geological framework. Miss 7 itself was not one uniform warm episode. It contained climatic fluctuations, and assigning a local lake deposit to that broad interval still requires correlation between regional sediments and global oxygen isotope patterns. The label narrows the possibilities, but it does not turn a complicated landscape history into a single date. Critics describe the approach as important and deserving serious consideration, while questioning whether it conclusively displaced the roughly 300,000-year age. That response is normal in geochronology. A new method rarely erases decades of interpretation immediately. It must be tested against sedimentology, fossil communities, paleomagnetism where available, climate correlations, and independent dating systems. Agreement among methods strengthens confidence. Conflict reveals that one or more assumptions remain incomplete. The public story, however, moved faster than the scientific debate. Headlines announced that the spears were 100,000 years younger and that Neanderthals had made them. Both statements were more definite than the evidence justified. The new study proposed a persuasive younger model, but no human bones appeared in the layer, and an archaeological age estimate does not identify a maker by itself. Even at 200,000 years, regional population history was complex. Neanderthals would be plausible, perhaps likely, but not proven owners of the tools. The safest language remains deliberately broad. The weapons were deposited somewhere between roughly 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, although their exact age remains actively debated. That range may feel unsatisfying, but it accurately reflects the current state of evidence. Archaeology often advances not by replacing uncertainty with instant certainty, but by defining the uncertainty more precisely. The younger chronology also changes the emotional perspective of the site. At 300,000 years, Schöningen seems to push organized hunting deep into a period once imagined as behaviorally limited. At 200,000 years, it becomes part of a growing record showing that Neanderthals and closely related populations possessed complex technologies long before Homo sapiens entered most of Europe. Either interpretation overturns the old scavenger stereotype. The disagreement concerns when and by whom, not whether the woodworking and hunting were sophisticated. For the moment, the tiny snail opercula stand beside the long spears as unlikely rivals in the same mystery. One preserves molecular change, the other preserves human intention. Together they show how the deepest past must be reconstructed from evidence operating at radically different scales. A weapon more than 2 meters long can reveal balance and skill, while a shell smaller than a fingertip can move the entire scene across 100,000 years. In 2025, that small evidence pulled Schöningen toward a younger world. The ground, however, had not finished answering back. The ground answered back in 2026 with the new stratigraphic reassessment that defended the older chronology. Rather than accepting the spear horizon as a straightforward MS7 deposit near 200,000 years ago, researchers rebuilt the wider sequence of sediments, fossils, and interglacial phases preserved around Schöningen. Their conclusion placed the weapon-bearing layer within an earlier climatic cycle. Most plausibly, marine isotope stage 9 close to 300,000 years ago. The disagreement was no longer simply between an old date and a new one. It had become a contest between different ways of reading the same buried landscape. Stratigraphy begins with order. Layers deposited below are generally older than those above, but real geological sequences are rarely as neat as a stack of pages. Lakes expand and contract, shorelines erode, channels cut into earlier sediments, floods move shells, bones, and plant remains. Long intervals may leave little sediment, while brief events can deposit thick packages quickly. At Schöningen, mining exposed an unusually long succession, but that very richness created complexity. Researchers had to determine which local layers belonged to which regional warm stages and whether apparent boundaries represented continuous deposition or hidden gaps. The 2026 study reconstructed 3 successive interglacial cycles in the Schöningen sequence. It argued that the fossil communities, sediment relationships, and broader biostratigraphy fit an older framework better than the recent amino acid model. Particular mammals and mollusks appeared in combinations considered more consistent with MES9 than MES7. No fossil species functions as a perfect date stamp, because animals can survive longer in one region than another, but assemblages can still provide strong chronological signals when several taxa point in the same direction. This older placement restored the weapons to the time range in which they had long been discussed. Yet it did not simply return science to its previous position. The new reassessment was written in direct response to the 2025 challenge, so every assumption had to be defended more explicitly. Which deposits were genuinely associated with the hunting horizon? Were freshwater shells reworked from older sediments? Did the amino acid results reflect burial temperatures accurate? Could local erosion create a misleading sequence? The debate forced both chronologies to expose their weakest points. Biostratigraphy carries uncertainties of its own. Animal populations migrate, disappear locally, and sometimes persist beyond the intervals assigned to them elsewhere. Fossil identification may change when specimens are re-examined. Regional environments can preserve unusual survivors. For these reasons, the presence of one horse, vole, or mollusk cannot fix an age by itself. The 2026 argument depended on the structure of the complete sequence and the combined ecological pattern, not on a single diagnostic species. Even then, the authors were defending a model, not uncovering a written date. Another independent line of evidence entered the discussion through ancient horse DNA. In 2025, researchers recovered mitochondrial DNA from two Schöningen horses identified as Equus mosbachensis. Ancient DNA from such old temperate deposits is difficult to obtain because heat, water, microbes, and chemical change break genetic material into increasingly small fragments. Recovering mitochondrial sequences from these animals was therefore an achievement in itself. The genetic results helped place the Schöningen horses within the evolutionary history of Middle Pleistocene equids. Their position appeared more compatible with the older chronology than with a date near 200,000 years. These Schöningen horses fell among lineages that seemed to diverge earlier than a younger MS7 placement would comfortably suggest. This did not provide a direct radiometric date. Molecular relationships depend on evolutionary models, mutation rates, sample coverage, and the limited number of comparable ancient horse genomes. Still, the DNA created another reason to hesitate before declaring the chronology solved. The study itself acknowledged the conflict. Its genetic evidence leaned toward the older age, while the newly published amino acid chronology favored the younger one. Error ranges remained broad enough that neither line could close the case alone. Mitochondrial DNA traces only maternal ancestry, and a lineage can persist for long periods before disappearing. An animal carrying an anciently diverged mitochondrial branch does not necessarily live immediately after that branch formed. Genetic age and depositional age are related, but they are not identical. This is why the Schöningen debate is scientifically valuable. Independent methods are supposed to test one another. When they agree, confidence rises. When they conflict, the answer is not to select the most exciting result and ignore the rest. Researchers return to samples, assumptions, correlations, and context. The amino acids in snail opercula, the stratigraphic order of lake deposits, the composition of mammal communities, and mitochondrial fragments from horses all measure different aspects of the past. Each can be precise in one respect while remaining vulnerable in another. The argument also changes the possible identity of the hunters without resolving it. An age near 300,000 years makes a broad Homo heidelbergensis label or an early population on the Neanderthal lineage more commonly discussed. An age near 200,000 years makes Neanderthals a stronger possibility. But the same caution survives both models. No human fossil lies securely in the weapon-bearing layer. A date can narrow candidates, not place a species name into an absent skeleton. Behavior remains the stable center while chronology shifts around it. Whether the hunting episodes occurred closer to 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, the wooden assemblage still records advanced selection of timber, controlled manufacture, multiple weapon forms, repair, reuse, and repeated exploitation of horses. The age determines how early these capacities appear within European human evolution, but it does not erase them. Both chronologies belong to a world long before Homo sapiens became established across the continent. There is also a useful warning here about archaeological certainty. Famous numbers become attached to discoveries until they seem inseparable from the objects themselves. For decades, the Schöningen spears were known as the 300,000-year-old weapons. In 2025, they rapidly became the 200,000-year-old spears in many reports. By 2026, the older model had returned with renewed support. The artifact had not changed. The sediment had not moved. Only the methods and arguments used to translate geology into time had shifted. Resolution may require new samples from undisturbed contexts, firmer links between dated fossils and the exact artifact horizon, and methods not yet available. Until then, disagreement is not a flaw. It shows that Schöningen still contains more information than any single chronology can securely extract. For now, the most responsible image leaves the date slightly blurred. The hunters stand beside a changing lake somewhere between roughly 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Around them are horses, worked wood, stone edges, wet ground, and knowledge accumulated through practice. Behind them lies an uncertain branch of human ancestry. Ahead lies a scientific dispute carried by shells, fossils, sediment, and DNA. The spears remain beautifully direct evidence of intention, while the age of that intention stays open, suspended across 100,000 years. Schöningen belongs to a much longer history than the coal mine first seemed to reveal. Its weapons are exceptional because so many survived together, but they are not the beginning of wooden technology. They stand within a largely vanished age in which human beings shaped branches, trunks, bark, fibers, and handles for tasks that stone alone could never perform. Most of that age has rotted away. Only at rare waterlogged sites does the missing technology return, and when it does, the familiar timeline of human skill becomes deeper and less orderly. One of the closest comparisons comes from Schöningen, also in northern Germany. There, a yew-spear about 2.38 meters long was found associated with the remains of a straight-tusked elephant. The discovery was made in 1948, but renewed study has refined the relationship among the wooden weapon, elephant bones, and butchery traces. Schöningen is younger than the oldest proposed age for Schöningen, and is generally connected with Neanderthals, although the event remains debated. The spear lay among evidence that humans had access to an animal weighing several tons, an encounter on a scale far beyond the hunting of one horse. It is tempting to imagine a hunter driving the yew point into the elephant, but archaeology cannot provide that scene with certainty. The animal may have been attacked, dispatched when weakened, or exploited under circumstances combining hunting and opportunity. Cut marks and processing traces show human use of the carcass, while the spear demonstrates that large wooden weapons remained part of the European toolkit. Whatever the sequence, Schöningen extends the Schöningen lesson. Archaic humans were not limited to passive scavenging, and their relationship with very large prey could involve planning, danger, anatomical knowledge, and coordinated labor. Farther south, at Marathusa I in Greece, the wooden record reaches deeper. Artifacts dating to roughly 430,000 years ago include worked wooden implements associated with an elephant-rich lakeside context. These objects are not securely identified as hunting spears. Some appear better suited to digging, levering, scraping, or other handheld work. That distinction matters. Their importance lies not in forcing them into the dramatic category of weapons, but in proving that controlled woodworking was established long before the Schöningen deposits, whichever disputed date is accepted for the German site. Marathusa reveals a technological principle hidden by preservation. Early humans did not encounter wood as an occasional emergency material. They understood it as a resource with varied mechanical possibilities. A pointed digging implement behaves differently from a balanced spear. A wedge, handle, club, or scraping tool demands another shape. The surviving objects imply an older tradition from which later forms could develop, diversify, and travel with human populations across changing environments. Other discoveries add scattered pieces to the picture. Wooden points from Clacton in England and fragmentary implements from European and African contexts show that shaping wood has deep roots. Some finds remain disputed because natural branches can imitate simple tools, and dating organic material is often difficult. The evidence remains incomplete. But Schöningen is no longer an isolated miracle. It is the richest surviving chapter in a book from which most pages have dissolved. This wider record has sometimes been described as evidence for a forgotten wood age. The phrase is useful if it does not replace one oversimplification with another. Prehistoric people did not pass through a separate age when wood displaced stone. The materials worked together. Stone edges felled, trimmed, split, and scraped timber. Wooden handles improved leverage. Spears carried force into prey. Digging sticks opened soil. Containers, bindings, and carrying devices may have expanded what groups could gather and transport. The lesson is not that archaeologists named the wrong material age, but that the Stone Age was always more organic than its surviving artifacts suggest. Schöningen changed the debate because it made that organic intelligence impossible to ignore. This site demonstrated not merely ownership of wooden weapons, but mastery across a chain of operations selecting trees, obtaining timber, transporting it, following grain, balancing shafts, shaping points, repairing damage, and reusing fragments. Each step required decisions based on experience. Together they formed a technical tradition capable of producing reliable equipment rather than improvised sticks. Hunting placed that tradition under severe pressure. A poorly made domestic tool wastes time. A poorly made weapon can cost an opportunity or expose a hunter to a powerful animal at close range. Reliability therefore mattered. So did cooperation. Repeated horse hunting at Schöningen suggests people who could anticipate herd movement, position themselves usefully, respond when animals change direction, and process carcasses before valuable resources were lost. The exact signals, roles, and group size remain unknown, but successful repetition is difficult to explain without shared knowledge. That knowledge was likely transmitted through demonstration as much as speech. A skilled maker could show how to sight along a shaft, where to begin a split, or how to feel a hidden weakness beneath the grain. A practiced hunter could teach where to stand relative to wind and water, when to throw, and how to approach a wounded animal safely. Archaeology cannot hear those lessons, yet the competence of the artifacts suggests that learning connected generations. The weapons also reveal restraint. Their makers remove material carefully rather than pursuing maximum sharpness at the cost of strength. They repaired objects instead of discarding every damaged piece. They selected different forms for different distances and opportunities. Mastery was not simply aggression directed at prey. It was control over material, movement, timing, and effort. The hunt succeeded because many quiet judgments had already succeeded. Seen from this perspective, the uncertain age becomes part of the importance rather than an obstacle. If the deposits are near 300,000 years old, Schöningen pushes organized wooden weapon systems remarkably deep into the Middle Pleistocene. If they are closer to 200,000 years old, the site offers extraordinary evidence for Neanderthal hunting traditions and social cooperation. In either case, no human fossil identifies the makers directly, and no responsible account should pretend otherwise. Yet the behavioral conclusion remains stable. A human population before Homo sapiens became established in northern Europe had developed a sophisticated, repeatable art of hunting. The coal mine exposed that conclusion by accident. Machines seeking ancient vegetation compressed into fuel cut through another use of ancient trees, created not by geology but by intention. The dark shafts lifted from the sediment were tools, weapons, memories of practice, and evidence of relationships among people. Their makers disappeared, but their decisions survived in the taper of a point and the balance of a shaft. Schöningen's legacy is larger than the question of who threw one spear. It restores a missing dimension of humanity, the long history of shaping living materials into knowledge that could be carried in the hand. And now the scene begins to quiet. The mine recedes, the engines fall away, and the old lake returns in imagination beneath a wide northern sky. Water touches reeds along an uncertain shore. Horses move at the edge of visibility, then pass beyond it. Somewhere among the trees, a straight young trunk stands before any hand has chosen it. Time will take almost everything from this place. It will erase tracks, voices, clothing, shelters, and the names by which people knew one another. It will dissolve the cords that may have bound tools, the containers that carried food, and the smaller wooden objects used until they broke. It will change the lake into sediment and the forest into buried carbon. Even the hunters themselves will leave no bones in the layer that preserved their weapons. Yet a few pieces of wood sink where oxygen cannot reach them. Mud closes gently over cut marks and polished surfaces. The points remain dark and silent while climates turn above them. Forests advance. Cold returns. New animals cross the land. Human populations arrive, mingle, vanish, and are replaced. No one remembers the lake, but the lake keeps a fragment of memory without understanding what it holds. When those fragments return to light, they do not tell us everything. They cannot settle their own age or name the hands that shaped them. They cannot replay the hunt or recover the language spoken beside the water. They offer something quieter proof that skill can be older than expectation, that absence can mislead, and that much of human history was written in materials designed to disappear. The spears beneath the coal mine endure because the ordinary chain of decay was briefly interrupted. Their survival is not the rule. It is a rare mercy of water, sediment, and chance. Around them lies the vast unseen archive of all that rotted away handles, baskets, cords, shelters, shafts, and countless ordinary objects whose makers once trusted them completely. So the final image is not a weapon in flight. It is a wooden shaft resting beneath still water, its point aimed nowhere, its work finished. Above it, centuries gather into millennia. Below it, the mud holds the shape of a human decision. And in that narrow space between disappearance and survival, the ancient hunters remain not as names or faces, but as patience, balance, memory, and hands that once understood the grain of a tree.